Welcome back. So in this video, I'd like to do a close discussion of All Animals Are Equal, the chapter by Peter Singer that you read for this week, that you're reading for this week. And this chapter comes from Peter Singer's 1975 book, Animal Liberation. I mean, this is a very controversial book when it came out, and in some ways it still is, even now, almost 50 years later. But it was also incredibly influential, right? In terms of bringing to sort of the mainstream kind of contemporary world, well-structured arguments for the moral standing of other animals, and really engaging with the concept of speciesism. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so to get started, let's talk about this concept of speciesism that Peter Singer engages with. Okay, so speciesism is considered the discrimination based on one's membership in a particular species. And so this usually manifests on his account and others who have discussed and studied this concept, right? This usually manifests as a discrimination on the part of humans in relation to other species. And so this can either be the direct prioritization of humans over other animals, or it could also be something like prioritizing certain species of animals over other animals based on our interest in relation to them or our perception of them. And so here you could say something like, yeah, certainly prioritizing humans over other animals based solely on their membership in the species Homo sapien could be called a kind of speciesism, right? But also something like saying that I'm going to prioritize the lives of dogs and cats over the lives of cows and chickens and turkeys, right, could also be a kind of speciesism in this second way that I highlight here, prioritizing some species over others based on our relation to them or our relationship or our perceptions of them. And usually the way that speciesism is discussed is emphasized as a kind of human arrogance or a superiority over other species. Okay, so Peter Singer starts from the discussion of what he's asking, really what are widely held views of human equality based on? And he wants to ask what it means for something to be equal, right? And so it's really important to state up front that in this piece, he makes it clear, right, that he is not advocating for equal treatment of humans and other animals. Okay, he's emphasizing the equal consideration of interests. Okay, and so this is what's called preference utilitarianism, and he's also arguing here, of course, for a kind of impartiality, right? He wants to say that interests can differ from treatment, right? Certainly. So if we were to base an ethic on treatment, we would actually fail to recognize the diversity of different preferences that different humans and different organisms, different kinds of animals have, right? So he wants instead to have an ethic that emphasizes weighing everyone's preferences equally. So for him, what this means is that you are considering the interests of all those impacted by a decision or decisions. And impartiality is going to mean that you're not going to claim that anyone's preferences should be weighed higher than anyone else's, right? No one's preferences are less important. And this, on his account, means that if you were to choose to not weigh the interests of all equally, this would be a kind of discrimination, right? Okay, so on Singer's account, if what's most morally important is one's experience of pleasure and suffering, right? Remember, he argues that the moral standing is really grounded in this capacity for sentience, right? This capacity to experience pleasure, pain, to suffer, to have pleasure or to suffer, right? So if the grounding of one's moral standing is in that, then he wants to argue that species membership shouldn't exclude one from moral consideration, right? So he states that the capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in any meaningful way. So there's this consideration here that he puts forward too, is that like, do humans have an inherent dignity that animals do not, that other animals do not? And if so, what traits are unique to humans that are important? And are these traits shared by all humans? You know, this is actually really crucial for him, right? He wants to say that a lot of the justifications for why humans matter more than animals on people's accounts are using rationale centering certain capacities that some humans have that many humans don't have, right? And also, is the prioritization of humans really rooted in intelligence? Again, this is something that he wants to claim is not shared by all humans, and is certainly seen in some animals, right? And is moral consideration rooted in a normative conception of human intelligence that grants moral considerability to all humans, even if they don't meet the supposed threshold of what is considered normal, right? And this is another really crucial question. Okay, so if having interests is rooted in sentience, as in the capacity to experience pleasure and suffering, then on Singer's account, humans are definitely not alone in this interest, right? Sentience, again, is this capacity for conscious experience, the ability to value one's existence, and the ability to experience pleasure and pain. So humans in general seem to have an interest in not suffering, right? But so do many animals. Humans and other animals both have better or worse states and subjective experiences of those states. Perhaps not all animals, right? Perhaps not all humans, right? But many, right? So if we're looking at the equal consideration of interest, then on Singer's account, he's going to say that prioritizing humans based solely on membership in the species Homo sapien is speciesism, okay? And for him, this is a discrimination that is akin in some ways to racism, sexism, and so forth, right? And is this really the case? So think about this. Do you think this? Because Singer certainly argues this, okay? And I just want to highlight too that there's been some psychological studies done on some of the kind of claims that Singer's put forward. So this was a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, I believe, called The Moral Standing of Animals Toward a Psychology of Speciesism. And in some ways, the people that wrote this paper that did this study found that some of what Singer was claiming was true, seemed to correlate to actual people's experiences. So this is a quote from that piece. They say, "Our research showed that the philosophers were right when they drew an analogy between speciesism and other forms of prejudice. Speciesism correlates positively with racism, sexism, and homophobia, and seems to be underpinned by the same socio-ideological beliefs. Similar to racism and sexism, speciesism appears to be an expression of social dominance orientation, the ideological belief that inequality can be justified and that weaker groups should be dominated by stronger groups. In addition, speciesism correlates negatively with both empathy and actively open-minded thinking. Men are more likely to be speciesist than women, yet there are no correlations with age or education." Okay, so again, seems to be really interesting that there was research done on this that correlated with some of what Singer has claimed. Okay, so another question here that comes up from many people that read Singer, and indeed other philosophers who make sort of claims grounded that moral standing is grounded in sentience, is Singer's sentientism more defensible than speciesism, right? So sentientism is centering moral concern on sentience, beings, those who have, have sort of the capacity to experience pleasure and suffering, right? And the question here is, are there important moral differences between those who have interests and those who do not? And why or why not? So you want to think about this. So think about the example of the Singer uses of kicking a mouse versus kicking a stone. Right. It seems like we look at those as very different situations because there's a case where you can't really wrong a stone on this kind of account because a stone doesn't have interest, right? Kicking a stone is not harming the stone, right? It doesn't have an interest whether to be kicked or not, right? But on the other hand, right, the mouse definitely seems to have an interest in this case, right? The mouse seems to have an interest not to be kicked, not to be harmed, right? So those are very different moral questions for Singer, and he wants to claim that this is why there's something special about grounding moral standing in sentience. That sentience has sort of moral brings around moral obligations that don't go toward other sort of non-sentient organisms or entities. Right. Okay, so again, really important to emphasize here that Singer is not advocating for equal treatment, but rather he's advocating for equal consideration of equal interest or preferences. And what is the most widely held shared interest? It is, on his account, he wants to say it's to avoid pain and seek pleasure. And these preferences should be weighed equally, right? The preference to avoid suffering, the preference to seek pleasure, right, should be weighed equally on his account. So not doing so based on a category arbitrary to one's capacity to experience pain and pleasure constitutes discrimination, right? So he wants to say, right, like, simply because I'm human and my dog is not human, my dog is a member of a different species, right? That doesn't change the preference that those organisms have toward avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, right? That my dog desires to avoid pain as much as I do, right? Okay, so why is equal consideration not equal treatment? Okay, so this is on Singer's account. He wants to say that suffering is weighed equally, but interest, and he doesn't say this, right? But on his account, interest can lead to a hierarchy, right? So a hierarchy of interest, right? So where some beings will still be prioritized over others, right? So quantity, quality, and complexity of experience are factors that Singer claims are important in this consideration of different interests, right? So this is really tough to consider, right? Is like, what does it mean to have a more complex pleasure, right? This is something he talks about, right? Does a normal human, normal, I want to say on his account, right? Because this is a super problematic approach in some ways that he's taking, centering a kind of normative conception of normal humans, right? Does a human have more complex pleasures than a dog, right? I feel like that's definitely an open question, right? So there's also for him here, there's this awareness of interest that's important, right? So he seems to say that, right, like that some organisms will have a more complex understanding of their existence and their interests, right? Their interests are more complex than others, right? Also, right, really important to highlight here is the anticipation of future hopes and fears that can play into sort of, there could perhaps be increased suffering because of an anticipation of future suffering, right? That these sort of like this idea of an identity through time can lead to sort of more complex interests as well, right? And also social ties, right? So say something like, Singer would probably say something like this. So like, my dog may have friends that my dog meets when I take my dog out for a walk and meet other dogs and so forth. Yeah, they have a community of social ties, right? Many animals do, right? But certainly also humans do. And so Singer would probably say that most humans have more social ties, more like, so I probably have more people that care about me than my dog has that care about them, right? So these social ties and these social networks are sort of also going to lead to a sort of hierarchy of interests on his account, right? Okay. So for Singer, why is this problematic? Why is this an issue? So for Singer, a lot of what he's arguing in this piece really seems to map on to an assumed centered, neurotypical human, right? So like, there's obviously also very problematic ableistic language in this piece, and obviously it was written in 1975, but it doesn't really change the underlying arguments, which are also ableist in a lot of ways, right? So just to highlight though that Singer still maintains much of what he claimed in this piece now, although he may not use the same language. He still advocates for the fundamental aspects of sort of that which are ableist, right? That manifest, blatant assumptions of non-neurotypical or neurodivergent humans, and certainly animals as well, right? So what's really interesting about this too is that Singer doesn't really go into this, but what he kind of shows in this piece in some ways is that a lot of what we consider speciesism, a lot of like the sort of arbitrary sort of prioritization of human interests over animals, people might make claims that that's based on species membership, but oftentimes it's also, maybe first and foremost, arguments are based in sort of capacities or ability, right? So in a lot of ways, the prioritization over human interest is actually often a kind of ableism. And so you could make the claim that Singer perhaps had a missed opportunity here to engage more with that. Okay, so another question here that I think is really important is that does Singer, so he's prioritizing interest, but does this approach recognize intrinsic value in beings? So remember, intrinsic value is having a value on your own, of your own self. Like your life matters simply because you care about it, right? This is a notion of intrinsic value. And so this would be a value regardless of what humans or other beings get from someone, right? Again, non-teleological, this value doesn't depend on its relationship to something else. And you are an end in yourself. You are not exchangeable or irreplaceable. So, I value my life, even if you were to replace me with somebody that was very similar to me, right? That would still be harming me, and it would still be going against my interest, my value for my own life, right? Okay, so does Singer believe in this? Does Singer argue for a kind of intrinsic value in other animals? Well, no, not really. So for Singer, suffering is actually prioritized over death, right? So he thinks that the primary problem is suffering, not necessarily death, right? So a death with minimal fear or a minimal fear in death or minimal suffering in death is acceptable in his account, right? And so this is really most profound, I think, with regard to the question of replaceability. So if what is being prioritized is the interest or experience of suffering and pleasure, then the death of a being can be justified if they're replaced by one with a similar or more complex experience, okay? So on this account, something like animal testing, research on animals could easily be justified if there was minimal recognition of individuality in the animal that was being tested on, if there was minimal ability to anticipate the future, and most importantly, if the research was painless, right? So if the research was done on an animal and that animal was euthanized, if the research didn't cause suffering and the animal was euthanized without suffering, right, then Singer would seemingly not really see an issue with that, right? So this is potentially problematic for people who take more kind of hard rights approaches with regard to other animals. Okay, so also this is an important question too, right? So do humans have more interests, or are our interests just different, right? So certainly different humans have different interests, and animals also have interests distinct from humans. But it seems to be that Singer's making a claim in this piece that humans have more interest than animals. So if so, then Singer really is going to claim, he's generally going to come down and say that in by and far most cases, humans should be prioritized over other animals. But at the same time, Singer's also doing something here that is saying that we do need to take much more seriously the suffering of other animals as being a serious moral problem, right? But definitely Singer thinks that humans should usually be prioritized over other animals who have fewer interests, okay? But to the degree that animals do have interests, we are morally obligated on his account to consider those interests. So in principle, this is a non-hierarchical approach then. But this is problematic within the context of just humans, right? Because even if we're not considering other animals, right, Singer is still centering a normative conception of human, right? He's prioritizing a new normative conception of human, and all others are incorporated into this logic, right? So all others are compared to sort of this logic of what it is to be a normal human, right? And again, I just want to highlight some serious ableistic issues with this, not just the language, but also many of the claims that were put forward in this piece. But I think it's a useful piece to explore, and definitely a very influential piece by a very influential philosopher. And I hope you enjoyed getting a chance to explore it. Okay, and with that, I will see you next time.